We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Chaf Tesam at Aleph and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 129a. And the previous Amud Mar Zutra said that the halacha is like Rabbi Abba in all of the cases where Rabbi Abba issued rulings. There were a bunch of cases in the previous Daf of rulings of Rabbi Abba. And the Gemara said, La'afuke mai. The Gemara asked on the previous Amud, what is that coming to exclude? Because the rulings of Rabbi Abba were essentially uncontested. And the Gemara now continues, Ila'afuke midu Rava. If you're going to say that we're excluding Rava's position, but Rava was not really arguing with Rabbi Abba, Mosifu, he actually was adding on to what Rabbi Abba said. And the Rashbam explains, if this is to exclude Rava, Diyamar Af Barishon, he says that a third generation relative can testify even for a first generation relative, but he wasn't really arguing. V'halo Mosif, while Divrei Rabbi Abba, he was just adding on to what Rabbi Abba said. Diyamar Shlishi B'Sheni Kosher, because Rabbi Abba said that a third generation relative can testify for a second generation relative, and then Rava came along and said even for a first generation relative. The idea over here was, Rabbi Abba was saying that a person can testify for his first cousin once removed, and then Rava was coming and adding on, you can even testify for that upper generation. Let's say for a person's great uncle, you can testify for that as well. That's what he was coming to say. Even for someone in the first generation, the person is allowed to testify. And you could say that even Rabbi Abba admits to this idea of Af Barishon. Rabbi Abba was just coming to teach the Chiddush itself, that the third generation is kosher to testify for the second generation. The equal a mandamer b'Sanhedrin puzzle, because there happens to be a mandamer in Sanhedrin that says that is puzzle, that is not a good testimony. But Perek Zeborer, that's in Perek Zeborer. V'lav l'meidak mino. It's not that we're supposed to infer hashlishi barishon puzzle. We're not supposed to infer that Rabbi Abba would hold third generation to first generation would be disqualified. The dilma uvda have b'shlishi b'sheni. Maybe there just happened to have been a case of a third generation to a second generation. V'shalach leid the kosher, and he sent them that it's kosher, and so therefore it can't be that we're passing like Rabbi Abba to exclude Rava, because Rava is just adding on. And the Gemara continues, Imi de Mar bar Rav Ashi, if you're going to say that we're coming to exclude the position of Mar bar Rav Ashi, so less hilchasa Mar bar Rav Ashi. We don't hold like Mar bar Rav Ashi anyhow. And the Rashbam explains, Imi de Mar bar Rav Ashi, the Achsher ba'aba de Abba. Mar bar Rav Ashi was the one that let a grandson testify for his grandfather. But Hakvar ifsik de les hilchasa kavase. We've already paskined, we've already ruled that the halacha is not like that. Kedamrin Lael, we said that earlier. V'hach derasha de Mar Zutra basar hachi havoy. And here, when Mar Zutra is darshaning that the halacha is like Rabbi Abba in all of these rulings that happened after this, v'hachanami have de Mar bar Rav Ashi tosefes ela dadifa mina kaparech. The Gemara says you also could have said that Mar bar Rav Ashi also was just adding on, but the Gemara has a better question regarding Mar bar Rav Ashi. So again, you can't say that he's coming to exclude Mar bar Rav Ashi. And the Gemara continues, Ili afuke mi de Shmuel v'Rav Sheshes v'Rav Papa. If it's to exclude from the positions of Shmuel and Rav Sheshes and Rav Papa, again, they said earlier that if somebody saw something and then they became blind in various situations, they might be able to testify. And Mar Zutra is coming and saying that is not the case. The halacha is like Rabbi Abba, that a blind person is not allowed to testify. Ha'itosu, but they've already been refuted. They were refuted on the previous summit from a brisa. And so the Gemara says, Ela rather liafuke mid Rabbi Yochanan u'me'askafta de Mar bar Rav Ashi. He's paskening. Mar Zutra is saying that the halacha is like Rabbi Abba to exclude the position of Rabbi Yochanan and to exclude the question that was asked by Mar bar Rav Ashi. And the Rashbam explains, liafuke mi Rabbi Yochanan, to exclude Rabbi Yochanan, do Amar eino nemon k'Rabbanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that a father is not believed to say, this son of mine is a Bechor, he follows the Rabbanan, and we're coming to exclude that position. The father is believed to identify the Bechor. Ume'askafta de Mar bar Rav Ashi, and also from the question of Mar bar Rav Ashi, that's in the case where a person, the borrower, says that he owes half of the money, but then there are actually witnesses on the borrower's side saying he doesn't owe any of the money. So Mar bar Rav Ashi said he should be a Meshev Aveda. It should be considered like he's returning a lost object. He should not have to take an oath, but we do not paskin like that. We paskin he's considered to be a modeh b'mixas, and he has to take an oath. V'les hilchasa kivasei. The halacha is not like that. Kevan da'akati kishahoda lo heidu edim. Because in that case where the lova admitted, he admitted before the witnesses testified. V'lo kamisayle, they weren't yet supporting him. Ikalamemar demir sasminayu. So you could say he's actually afraid. He doesn't know what they're going to say. He's afraid they might testify against him. She'eno yodei ma'balibam k'Rabbi Abba. He doesn't know what they're thinking like Rabbi Abba. Again, we rule that he does have to take, the lova does have to take a shvuas modeh b'mixas. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, "Hamechalik in the chasav al piv." If somebody distributes his property verbally, riba la'echad umiyat la'echad v'chulu. If he gives a little more to one and a little less to the other, that is going to be effective if he uses a language of matana. But if he does not use a language of matana, if he doesn't use a language of a gift, but rather uses the language of Yerusha, of inheritance, that's problematic because it's going against the laws of inheritance that are in the Torah. And the Gemara says, "Hechi dami matana b'tchila, hechi dami be'emtza, hechi dami basof." What is the case where you're using a language of matana in the beginning of the sentence? What is the case where you're using it in the middle of the sentence? What's the case where you're using it at the end of the sentence? The Mishnah said, wherever you use a language of matana, that will be sufficient. And the Gemara says, "Ki yasser Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yochanan." When Rav Dimi came, he said that Rav Yochanan said, "Tinasein sadeh plonis leploni v'yirsha zui matana b'tchila." If the language is, give this field to so and so, and he will inherit it. So there, the word tinasein is at the beginning of the sentence. That's matana b'tchila. Yirsha v'tinasein lo. Let's say the language is, he should inherit it, and it will be given to him. Zui matana basof. That's where the language of matana is used at the end. And yirsha v'tinasein lo v'yirsha. If he says inherit it and give it to him and inherit it, so there in the middle of the phrase, Zui matana be'emtza, that's an example where the language of matana is in the middle. And the Gemara continues, V'da'afka ba'adam echad v'sada achas. All of this is only true if we're talking about one person in one field. Aval ba'adam echad u'shtei sadas, but if you're talking about one person in two fields, or sada achas u'shnei b'nei adam, or let's say you're talking about one field and two people, so then we don't say that the language of giving that's used pertaining, let's say, to individual number one is going to apply to individual number two, or to field number one is going to apply to field number two. The point is that if you use a language of matana by one field, and you use a language of Yerusha by the other field, we don't automatically apply the language of matana to that second field, and the same if there were two individuals. And the Rashbam explains, "V'dafka ba'adam echad v'sada achas," only if it's one person getting one field, meaning devahu sada shenasan la'oso ish, meaning in that field that he gave to that particular individual. So ika matana bahadi lashon Yerusha, he used both the language of matana and Yerusha. Then we would say that the language of matana would be the one that we would focus on and say that's considered to be matana and is effective. Aval ba'adam echad u'shtei sadas, but let's say it's one person in two fields, meaning could go in, for example, Yirash Ruvain sada plonis shebemizrach v'tinasein lo l'Ruvain sada plonis shebema'ariv. Let's say you say he should inherit this field that's in the east, and he should be given this field that's in the west. So can we apply the language of tinasein lo to the field in the east? So ahu de lashon matana kani, no, we can't apply it. The one where he used the language of matana, there it's effective. Aval ahu de lashon Yerusha lo kani, but the field which he used the language of Yerusha, that would not be effective. De matana deheich lo mesayil idach. The fact that he used the language of matana by one of them doesn't help for the other one. Zos horish lo v'zos nasan lo. Rather, we say this one he gave it to him, he bequeathed it to him as a Yerusha. The other one he gave to him. Uvahid Yerusha have a masnal mashakasu b'Torah v'lo amar klum. And the one that's Yerusha, that's considered making a condition against the Torah, and it's nothing. And the same would be true in a situation where you had one field that you're dividing between two people. Again, you can't apply the language you used by one person to the other individual. And the Gemara continues. Rabbi Lazar says, Afilu adam echad u'shtei sados, even if it's one person in two fields, or sada achas u'shnei b'nei adam, or let's say it's one field and two people, even in those situations, as long as you use the language of matana by one of them, that is sufficient. Aval b'shtei sados u'shnei b'nei adam, but let's say it's two fields that are being given to two people, and so therefore by one of the fields given to one of the people you use the language of matana, by the other one you use Yerusha, you will not be able to apply the language of matana to that other individual. Lo, we will not be able to apply that, and the language, the individual where the language of Yerusha was used, is not going to be effective. And the Gemara continues, Kiyasa Ravin Amar, when Ravin came, he said, Tinasen sada plonis leploni v'yirash ploni sada plonis. Let's say you have a case where a person says, give this field to so-and-so should inherit this field. Rabbi Yochanan Omer Kana, Rabbi Lazar Omer Lo Kana. Rabbi Yochanan would say in that situation that it is a good kinyan, and Rabbi Lazar would say that it's not a good kinyan. And the Rashbam explains, Kiyasa Ravin Amar Yirash Ploni. When Ravin came, he said in a situation where he says Yirash Ploni, etc. Hainu Shtei Sadus Ushnei B'nei Adam. The case of Ravin is a simple case of two fields and two people. And again, according to Ravin, that was a machlokus between Rabbi Lazar and Rabbi Yochanan. Umilsa Ba'an Pei Nafshei. According to Ravin, this was just an independent statement. V'lo Itmar Masnisin, it wasn't said on the Mishnah. Umiyu Hachinami Havim Mefarish L'Masnisin. Nevertheless, he would explain the Mishnah in the same fashion. And in Ravin's version, Rabbi Lazar is the one that says Lo Kana Hahud the Yerusha, the one where you use the language of Yerusha, it would not be a good kinyan. Again, it's a case of 2 fields and 2 people. That's why it's not good. But in Ravin's version, Rabbi Yochanan would say that it actually is effective even by the one of Yerusha. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Abaye le Ravin. Abaye said to Ravin, An chasas lan chada, you've made one of the Amoraim easier for us according to your version. V'askafis lan chada, but one of them actually has become more difficult. Meaning, Bishlamad Rebbe Lazar ad Rebbe Lazar, I understand the 2 versions of Rebbe Lazar, lo kasha, there's no difficulty at all. Because kan biyadam echad ushtei sados, in the first case, Rebbe Lazar would say if it's 1 person in 2 fields, so then we would say that it is a good kinyan. And kan b'shnei b'nei adam ushtei sados, and Rebbe Lazar says it's not a good kinyan when you're talking about 2 people in 2 fields, as we said. Elad Rebbe Yochanan ad Rebbe Yochanan kasha, but according to Ravin's version of Rebbe Yochanan, we have a real contradiction over here, because within Ravin's version of Rebbe Yochanan says that even in a situation of 2 people in 2 fields, that's a good kinyan. But in the earlier version of Rebbe Yochanan, we said it's not good, even if, let's say, you had 1 person in 2 fields or 2 people in 1 field. And so the Gemara answers to that, Amoroi ninu v'aliba de Rebbe Yochanan. You have to say there's a machlokas Amoroim within Rebbe Yochanan. What exactly did Rebbe Yochanan hold? And the Gemara continues with another opinion from the Amoraim. V'Reish Lakish Amar, and Reish Lakish says, Lo kanat sheyomer ploni uploni yirshu sada plonis uplonis shenesatem lohem b'matana v'yirshum. In a case of 2 people in 2 fields, the only way it's going to be a kinyan is if you phrase it in the following manner: so and so and so and so should inherit such and such and such and such a field that I am giving them as a matana, as a gift, and they should inherit them. And the Rashbam explains, first the Gemara said Amoroi ninu, there's a machlokas Amoraim within Rabbi Yochanan, meaning Anov Revdimi, meaning there's a machlokas Amoraim between myself, that's Ravin, and Revdimi. We have a machlokas Amoraim, what Rabbi Yochanan said. And then we have the opinion of Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish Amar Liolam Lo Kaneh. Reish Lakish says it's not going to be a kinyan b'shtei sados u'shnei b'nei adam, meaning in a case of 2 fields and 2 people, hahu de lashon Yerusha, if you used the language of Yerusha by one of the fields and people, that's not going to be effective. Ve'afilu ki amar l'shneim biyachan. Now that's even true if he said to both of them at once, tinasein sada plonis l'Ruvain v'sada plonis l'Shimon v'yirshum. Let's say the language was give that field to Ruvain and give that field to Shimon, and they should inherit them. It still will not be effective. To kevan de gufan muchlakin inu, because since you're talking about 2 separate givings over here, v'chol echad have a ma'isa b'fnei atzmo, each one is its own independent action. V'lo shayach zeh b'zeh klal, one is not really relevant to the other. You're giving 1 field to Ruvain and 1 field to Shimon. Hilkach shtei l'shonos shaloshin matana v'Yerusha. Therefore, the 2 languages that are being used, you're using a language of matana and Yerusha. Keneged shnei ma'asimim, we're going to say that one language will go on one and the other language will go on the other. Le'echad lashon matanu, le'echad lashon Yerusha. To one of them, it's going to be a language of gift that will work. The other one will be a language of Yerusha that will not work. Al rishon rishon ve'al achron achron. Whichever one you use first will go on the first one. Whichever one you use later will go on the later one. Hilkach lo kanu. Therefore, it will not be a kinyan. Reish Lakish is saying at sheyomer Yerusha betchila ve'Yerusha basof u'matana be'emsi. You specifically have to use the Yerusha language in the beginning and the end with the language of matana in the middle. Dahash the yalaf lashon matana mi lashon Yerusha. That way we can learn the language of giving to the language of Yerusha. Meaning, dechihechi the lashon Yerusha namar l'shneim, just like you use the language of Yerusha to both of them. Gam hamatana shebe'emsa, so to the language of matana in the middle. Namra bal karchach l'shneim. That's also being said. We have to say that's being said to both of them. The laman tirmi, because otherwise you can't figure out who that language goes on. V'hilkach tzarach lomar kein Ruvain v'Shimon yirshu sada plonis uplonis shanasati lehem b'matana v'yirshum. You use this language of Ruvain and Shimon will inherit these fields that I'm giving them as a gift, and they will inherit them. The al karchach yirshu kama ola al Ruvain ubasra al Shimon. The language of inherit in the beginning is going on Ruvain, and the later one's going on Shimon. Hilkach l'shneihen nami lashon matana kamer. Therefore, for both of them also, the lashon matana is going to be said. The ikatarti zimni lashon matana. You have over here 2 times really a language of giving. The chasav shenasati lahem the ma'ariv al lashon Yerusha v'ikatrei zimni lashon Yerusha, because you're saying shenasati lahem, and so therefore that language is mixed in with the lashon Yerusha, and you have 2 lashon Yerushas, and therefore again you apply the matana to both in this case. And the reference over here of the Rashbam is to the fact that Reish Lakish's language is shenasatim lahem b'matana. So you really have 2 languages of giving. You have shenasatim lahem and b'matana, and therefore each one goes on each individual, each giving of the field to that particular individual. And the Gemara continues, bepluk, so the machlokas we had above, which was a machlokas amoraim within Eretz Yisrael, is also machlokas amoraim in Bavel as follows. Amar Rav Hamnuna says, Lo shanu ela adam adam echad v'sada achas. This halacha that if you use a language of giving, that's only effective if it's one person in one field. Aval adam echad u'shtei sados, sada achas u'shnei b'nei adam. But let's say it would be one person in two fields or one field and two people. So then again, we would not apply the language of giving to the other individual. Rav Nachman says, afilu adam echad u'shtei sados, sada achas u'shnei b'nei adam. Even if it's one person in two fields or one field and two people. Aval shtei sados u'shnei b'nei adam lo. But let's say it's two fields and two people. Then again, we would not apply the language of giving to the other one. But Rav Sheisha says, afilu shtei sados u'shnei b'nei adam. Even if it's two fields and two people, it will be effective as long as you use the language of matana by one of them. That will apply to the other as well. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Sheisha says, Mina aminullah, from where can I prove this to you? To Tanya, because we learned in a Brayso, Homer Tenu shekel lifni b'Shabbos, if a person says, give a shekel to my son every week, as a way to support him, he's telling this to the apotropos, to the caretaker. Uru'uyin liten sela, if it's fit, give a sela, meaning, if there's a need that it should be more than a shekel, that it should be a sela, which is 2 shekel, so then no sin lahen sela, so then he should give a sela if that's what's needed. V'yamamar, however, if he says, al titnu lahen ela shekel, if he says, only give them a shekel, so then ein nosin lahen ela shekel, so then you can only give them a shekel. V'yamamar, and if he says, im mesu, if they die, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video, on Daf Kuf Chaf Tes Amud Beis.